Most people believe the silence around certain military incidents exists because the truth would cause panic. That's not why. Silence exists because some truths don't fit inside the systems designed to record them. And when something doesn't fit the system erases the event, not the other way around. I learned that the day I sat across from a pilot who had just chased something over the Pacific Ocean that did not behave like any aircraft ever built by human hands. My name is Richard J. Wolfe, former United States Air Force. I spent years inside operations that do not appear in public records. Not black projects you hear rumors about. Deeper than that. Compartments within compartments, where the fewer questions you asked, the longer you stayed employed. I wasn't a scientist. I wasn't an investigator. I followed orders. And on one particular night in 1987, my orders were simple. Conduct the interview. Write the report. Leave out anything that shouldn't exist. At the time, I didn't understand what that last instruction really meant. I do now. The pilot arrived just after midnight. No uniform, no insignia. They had already taken his flight suit, which is never a good sign. When command removes the uniform, it means what happened no longer belongs to the chain of command. It belongs somewhere else. He looked like someone who hadn't decided yet whether he should speak or forget. The room we used wasn't part of the official briefing wing. It sat below ground level in a section of the base most personnel didn't know existed. No windows, no clocks, a table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, a recorder that wasn't allowed to exist on paper. When he sat down, the first thing he said wasn't about the craft, it was about the radar. I locked onto it twice, he told me. That alone should have made the incident impossible to ignore. Radar confirmation means the object isn't just visual, it's physical, real enough to reflect energy. But the radar data had already been removed from the official systems before he even landed. That was my first clue this event had already been classified beyond the Air Force. I asked him to start from the beginning. Routine patrol west of the California coastline. Clear skies. Nothing unusual until his radar painted a contact moving in a way he couldn't reconcile with any flight profile he knew. The object appeared stationary at first, then it accelerated, not gradually, instantly. No climb, no descent, no visible propulsion, just motion. He said the strangest part wasn't the speed, it was the silence. Military pilots are trained to read sound as much as visuals. Even at distance, jet engines leave a signature in the air, a vibration you feel in your bones long before you see the aircraft. He said there was nothing, no turbulence, no exhaust trail, no thermal signature on his instruments, just an object that seemed to move through the sky the way a thought moves through the mind, effortlessly. He pushed his aircraft harder than regulations allowed, closed the distance, and that's when he saw it clearly. Not metallic in the way aircraft usually are, not reflective like aluminum or steel. The surface looked almost matte, as if it absorbed light instead of reflecting it. Oval-shaped, no wings, no control surfaces, no seams, nothing that suggested it had ever been assembled by human engineering. I asked him how close he got. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the table like he was replaying the moment frame by frame. Close enough, he finally said, to realize it knew I was there. That sentence sat in the air between us longer than anything else he said that night. Because pilots don't usually talk about aircraft as if they're aware. But the way he described it, awareness wasn't a metaphor. He said the craft adjusted its movement the moment he aligned behind it. Not evasive, not aggressive, just aware. Like it was observing him the same way he was observing it. Then he said something that still bothers me decades later. It slowed down, he said quietly, almost like it wanted me to keep up. That's when I realized the report I was writing was already useless, because the truth sitting across from me didn't belong in any document the Air Force was prepared to archive. And deep down, I think the pilot knew that too. The recorder on the table kept running. Neither of us spoke for a long time. And eventually I asked the only question that mattered. Not about speed, not about propulsion, not about origin. I asked him what happened when he got closer. He looked up at me slowly, and for the first time that night, he hesitated, as if saying the next part out loud might make it real again. And after everything I've seen since then, I think that hesitation was the most honest moment in the entire interview. Because whatever he saw inside that craft, it wasn't something a military pilot was ever supposed to witness. And it definitely wasn't something I was supposed to write down. But he told me anyway. And the moment he did, I understood why the radar data had already disappeared. Because the object he chased over the Pacific that night was never the most disturbing part of the story. The disturbing part was what looked back at him. The pilot didn't answer my question right away. People imagine military debriefings as fast, clinical exchanges. Questions, answers, data points stacked neatly into a report. That's not how real debriefings work when something happens that no one has prepared you for. Sometimes the room goes quiet, not because there's nothing left to say, but because both people understand that the next sentence will cross a line that cannot be uncrossed. I remember the sound of the recorder motor turning, soft, mechanical. The only thing in that underground room that sounded normal. The pilot finally leaned back in the chair and rubbed his hands together like he was trying to warm them, even though the room wasn't cold. "I got closer than I should have," he said. That was the first honest sentence. Pilots know the envelope of their aircraft. They know exactly how far they can push it before physics starts making decisions for them. He had already crossed that line chasing the object, but that wasn't the mistake he was talking about. I asked him how close. He said about 200 feet, close enough that the object filled most of his canopy. At that distance, you stop looking at something as an aircraft. You start seeing surface details, textures, imperfections. Except this thing didn't seem to have any. He described the surface again, not reflective, not polished. More like a material that swallowed light instead of returning it. Almost like looking at the night sky itself. He said the edges weren't sharp either. They looked softened, as if the object wasn't fighting the air around it the way normal aircraft do. I asked about propulsion. He shook his head. No heat plume, no exhaust, no visible intake, nothing rotating, nothing burning, just movement. And then he told me something that wasn't in the initial incident summary, something that had already been removed before the report reached my desk. The object changed orientation without banking. If you've never flown an aircraft, that might not sound strange. But every aircraft ever built by humans obeys the same basic rules. To change direction, you tilt, you bank, you adjust surfaces so lift shifts across the airframe. This object didn't do that. It moved like gravity had no authority over it. It simply pointed somewhere else and went. No transition, no aerodynamic struggle, like a thought changing direction. He said that's when he realized something. He wasn't chasing it. It was allowing him to stay nearby. I remember writing that sentence in my notes, and scratching it out, and writing it again. Because the language we had for aircraft behavior didn't fit what he was describing. And then he finally answered the question I had asked earlier, the one he didn't want to answer. "What happened when you got closer?" He looked at the recorder first, not at me, at the recorder. Then he said something that made me pause the tape for the first time that night. Through the canopy, I saw something inside. I remember asking him to repeat that, not because I hadn't heard it, but because repetition sometimes reveals exaggeration. Memory corrects itself when you say it twice. But he repeated it exactly the same way, calm, precise. I saw something inside the craft. I asked if there were windows. He said no. That was the part he couldn't explain. The surface had looked solid from a distance, but when he got close, parts of it became transparent. Not like glass, more like the material itself changed state. He said the interior lighting was dim, soft, nothing like cockpit illumination. And inside, he saw movement. At this point in the interview, most people expect panic, fear, something dramatic. But his voice stayed steady the entire time. Military pilots are trained observers. Even when something terrifies them, they describe it clinically, which somehow made what he said next even more unsettling. There was a figure, he said, small, seated, facing forward, not looking at him, not reacting, just present. I asked him how he could be sure it wasn't a reflection. He shook his head immediately. No cockpit reflections behave like that. He described the proportions carefully. The head slightly larger than human proportion, the body narrow, arms thin, no visible flight controls around it, no panels, no displays, no instrumentation that resembled anything we use, just the figure, and the craft responding instantly to changes in direction. I asked him if the figure looked biological. That question hung in the air longer than anything else I asked, because I think he understood what I was really asking. Was it alive, or was it something else entirely? He didn't answer for several seconds. Then he said something that I wrote down word for word. I don't know if it was flying the craft. That sentence changed the entire nature of the incident, because if it wasn't flying the craft, then what exactly was the relationship between the figure and the machine? Before I could ask another question, he told me what happened next, and this is the part that never made it into the official archive. The object stopped, not slowed, stopped, mid-air, over open ocean. The pilot said his aircraft shot past it before he could react. By the time he circled back, the sky was empty. No radar return, no visual contact, nothing, like it had never been there at all. When the radar operators later reviewed their scopes, the track had already been erased. No signature, no recording, no event. Just a routine patrol over the Pacific, but the pilot and I both knew that wasn't true, because 2 hours later, someone from outside the Air Force arrived to collect my notes, and that's when I realized something that still keeps me awake some nights. The object the pilot chased that night was not the first one they had seen, not even close. And the reason they knew exactly which parts of my report to remove was because they had already heard this story before, more than once. And the part they were most interested in was the figure inside. When the interview ended, the pilot didn't ask what would happen to the report. That told me something. Pilots are trained to care about documentation. Every abnormal event, every malfunction, every near collision gets written down and archived. That's how aviation stays safe. But he already knew this incident wasn't entering that system. You could see it in the way he stood up from the chair. No expectation, no protest, just quiet acceptance. I remember thinking that was strange at the time. Now I understand it better. When something happens in the military that falls outside the boundaries of explanation, the event doesn't just get classified, it gets redirected. About 40 minutes after the pilot left the room, the door opened again. 2 men walked in. Neither of them wore Air Force uniforms. No insignia, no visible rank. Just dark suits that looked like they had never been inside a flight hangar in their lives. That alone told me everything I needed to know. In the Air Force, even the intelligence officers wear some form of uniform when operating on base. These men didn't, which meant they didn't answer to the base commander. They answered to someone else. One of them asked for the recorder, not the tape, the entire machine. He unplugged it himself, placed it in a padded case like it was evidence. The other man asked for my notes. I handed over the legal pad without arguing. When you work long enough inside classified programs, you develop a sense for when something belongs to your chain of command, and when it doesn't. This didn't. The second man flipped through the pages slowly. When he reached the section where I had written about the figure inside the craft, he stopped. He didn't look surprised. That's the part I remember most clearly. No raised eyebrows, no questions. Just a quiet pause, like someone confirming a detail they were already familiar with. Then he looked up at me and asked a question that felt strangely rehearsed. Did the pilot describe the interior environment in detail? Not what he saw, not whether the craft was hostile. Interior environment. Like this was a technical checklist they had followed many times before. I told him exactly what the pilot had said. Dim lighting, no visible instrumentation, no recognizable control systems, just the figure seated forward. He nodded slightly. Again, not surprised, not impressed, just confirming something. Then he tore 2 pages out of my notes, cleanly, no hesitation, folded them once and slipped them into his jacket. Those were the pages describing the figure. The rest of the notebook he handed back to me. You can file the incident as radar interference and visual misidentification, he said. His voice was calm, professional, almost polite, like he was giving directions to a visitor who had taken the wrong hallway. I remember asking a question I probably shouldn't have asked. It slipped out before I could stop myself. Was this object known to you? Both men looked at me, not angry, just measuring how much curiosity I was about to show. The first man closed the recorder case. Then he answered in a way that seemed designed to shut the conversation down without actually lying. This event falls outside Air Force jurisdiction. That sentence told me more than any explanation would have. Because if it wasn't Air Force, and it wasn't Navy, and it belonged to a classification layer most service members never encounter. Compartmentalization inside the military is deep, but there are levels beyond it. Programs that borrow personnel temporarily and return them without explanation. Files that exist without signatures. Operations that appear nowhere in the defense budget. Most of us working on base understood those programs existed, but we also understood something else. You don't ask where they lead. The second man placed the recorder case under his arm and walked to the door. Before leaving, he looked back at me and said something I didn't understand at the time. You should consider yourself fortunate, he said. I asked him why. He gave a small smile. Because most people who see these things don't get the chance to document them. Then the door closed, and just like that, the entire incident changed ownership. The radar logs vanished from the system before sunrise. The pilot was transferred 3 months later. Routine reassignment according to the paperwork. But his name never appeared in flight rotation reports again. In my official report, the version that remained after those 2 pages disappeared, described nothing more than a radar anomaly over open water. Case closed. Except it wasn't, because about a year later, I heard the exact same story again. Different pilot, different ocean, same description of the craft, same description of the movement, and the same quiet mention of something sitting inside. By that point, I had already learned something important about secrets. The most controlled information isn't the existence of an object. Objects can be dismissed, misidentified, explained away. No, the most controlled information is the pattern. Because once you see the pattern, you realize these encounters weren't accidents. And that raises a question the government has never answered publicly. If these craft appear often enough that someone outside the Air Force already expects them, reports, then how long have they actually been watching them? And more importantly, why do they seem so interested in what's inside? By the time the second pilot's account reached me a year later, I already knew how the process worked. The room would be different. The paperwork would carry a different project label. But the structure of the conversation would be the same. You listen, you write carefully, and eventually someone arrives who decides what parts of reality are allowed to remain on paper. Most service members never notice the pattern. That's not a criticism. The system is designed that way. Events are isolated, reports are compartmentalized, personnel rotate, memory fades. But when you spend enough years inside the machinery, you begin to see the repetition. And repetition is what changes suspicion into certainty. The second pilot wasn't from the same base, different squadron, different patrol route. He had been flying over a stretch of open water far from the California coastline. But the moment he began describing the object, I felt something in my chest tighten. Same shape, same surface, same impossible movement. And then the sentence that made the room go quiet. I think something was inside it. You can imagine what went through my mind at that moment. Not fear, not disbelief, recognition. Because the first pilot had said almost the same words. Not identical, but close enough that coincidence stopped being a reasonable explanation. When I asked the second pilot how he noticed the interior, he described something that made the earlier account even stranger. He said the surface of the craft seemed to change when he approached. Not opening, not revealing windows. More like the material itself, allowing light through. As if the boundary between outside and inside wasn't fixed. I didn't interrupt him while he spoke. That's something you learn in these interviews. People reveal more when they don't feel challenged, and pilots especially are careful with their words. They know exaggeration destroys credibility. He described the figure inside almost the same way the first pilot had. Small frame, seated position, facing forward. No visible controls. No reaction to the aircraft approaching it. I asked him if the figure turned its head at any point. He said no. And that detail stuck with me. Because awareness doesn't always require movement. When animals observe you in the wild, sometimes they don't move at all. They simply remain aware. The second pilot chased the craft for less time than the first, maybe 2 minutes. Then the object performed a maneuver that ended the encounter instantly. It accelerated upward. Not climbing like an aircraft, not even like a rocket, just vertical disappearance. The radar track vanished the same way, clean, instant. No gradual loss of signal, just presence and then absence. By the time I finished the report, I already knew what would happen next. The same 2 men arrived, not immediately, but within the same night. Same suits, same quiet tone. Same polite removal of the pages describing the interior of the craft. At that point, I understood something important. This wasn't a reaction. It was a procedure. They already knew which lines of the report they needed, which details mattered, which ones had to disappear. And that meant something else, too. The phenomenon itself was not the mystery they were trying to solve. The mystery was the occupants. That realization stayed with me for the rest of my service. Because if these encounters had happened enough times for someone outside the Air Force to build a process around them, then somewhere there must have been a collection of these accounts, dozens, maybe hundreds, pilots describing the same craft, the same impossible movement, the same quiet figure inside. And if that collection existed, then someone somewhere had already asked a question I was too low in the system to ask. Not what are these craft, but something much more unsettling. Why do they let our pilots get close enough to see inside? Think about that for a moment. A vehicle capable of outrunning any fighter aircraft ever built. A machine that can stop midair, accelerate instantly, and disappear from radar without trace. If it wanted to avoid being seen, it could. Easily. But in both cases I documented, the craft slowed down, stayed within view. Almost like it was allowing observation. That possibility changes the entire nature of the encounter. Because when something far more advanced allows you to observe it, there's always a second question behind the first one. Who exactly is observing whom? I spent years telling myself that question didn't matter, that my job had simply been to write reports and follow instructions. But the older I got, the harder it became to ignore one uncomfortable thought. Those pilots believed they were chasing something. But what if that assumption was backwards? What if the craft over the Pacific wasn't trying to escape at all? What if it was simply allowing the encounter to happen, long enough to be noticed? And if that's true, then the question that kept me awake all those years wasn't about the craft. It was about the figure sitting inside it. Because if it knew we were there, and if it chose not to hide, then the real mystery was never the technology. The real mystery was intention. And after everything I saw in those interviews, I still don't know which possibility should worry us more. The idea that they were just passing through, or the possibility that they have been watching us for a very long time.